As you'll probably have gathered from the title of this post, my call to arms is not quite what I might have hoped. A grand total of 33 solid expressions of intent, and not all of them in my area. I've also received messages of support from well-meaning North Americans, Germans, Swedes and some others whose support is, for obvious reasons, more moral than actual. But I appreciate it nonetheless. Although this tally is, to put it mildly, disappointing, it's more a result of my reach, or rather lack of it, than anything else. If I was Sargon, I reckon I could have racked up 1,000 in an afternoon. But I'm not Sargon, and as my subscriber count has not moved in 2 months for reasons I can't fathom, I'm not likely to rival him anytime soon, if ever. So what now? After my appeal has fallen not so much on deaf ears, but on ears too far distant to hear. Well, predictably from some quarters, namely from Paul Davies, Greg Yule and someone calling himself NASA Shill, the obvious response came in the comments. Ridicule. And that is exactly what I expected when I decided to post this vid. NASA Shill has been asking me provocatively, how many you got? Well, you've got your answer. So have a good laugh. I've been laughed at before, and I will be again. It's unlikely to kill me. Paul Davies mocked me for suggesting that getting a criminal record for nothing to show for it was a fool's errand. Maybe he's right. But in our little to and fro, I suggested that if we did nothing, we'd get the society we deserved. To which he replied that he already had the society he wanted. I didn't really have anything to say to that until I watched Politico's latest video on honour killings and diversity, link to which is below. So I politely direct your attention to that, Paul Davies. Now, having dealt with those irritants, the question remains, what do I do now, still 96% short of my target? Give up? Well, that's the most obvious option, and it's the one I'm most inclined to take at this point. But it's early days and it's too early to give up. Making YouTube videos is not something that comes naturally to me, and it's only because I happen to have found a small audience, which I thought was quite big at the time, that I've continued to do them. But this kind of thing really does go against the grain for me, which is why I haven't dived head first into social media, with accounts on Twitter and Instagram and all the rest. But that reticence is probably one of the reasons why my channel isn't growing. With that in mind, and against every fibre of my being, I have relented and opened a Twitter account. I ain't happy about it, but I reckon it's necessary to improve my chances of increasing my reach. In particular, I'm kind of stalking Paul Embury, since he first mooted the idea of a campaign of civil disobedience in a speech he made at the most recent Leave Means Leave demo. A speech which appears to have cost him his position in the fibre gauge union. But as a committed old-fashioned socialist and trade unionist of the very best sort, he is the kind of left-winger that the Brexit movement needs. And Brexit does need left-wingers, not only to prevent it from being taken over completely by right-wingers, but also to ensure that it does actually happen. I was thinking that Paul is the single best hope of garnering the kind of support that we need, but I've also reached out to Richard Inman and will do the same for the DFLA. Richard, I think, is very focused on Tommy issues, and the DFLA more on resisting militant Islam and the rape gangs. But there is considerable overlap on both of these issues. Will it succeed? Well, like everything else we try from a grassroots level, almost certainly not. But that's no reason not to try. You don't enter the fray just because you think you're going to win. you should get involved depending on whether it's the right thing to do. Does that sound over earnest? Does it sound naive? Maybe. But that is one of the biggest struggles I have with myself. Do I avoid attempting to do things that are naive and overly optimistic in order that I'm not ridiculed and humiliated if they don't come off? If I allowed myself to be swayed by such things, that really would be cowardice. I don't profess to be even slightly courageous, but I don't think I'm as cowardly as all that. But I do maintain that we have to try something, anything. Boris may very well need some direct action to prevent the anti-democrats in Parliament from finding ever more inventive and treacherous ways in which to stop Brexit. Depending on what opinion you read, and in which newspaper, and on what day you read it, there seems to be more outlandish ideas every day that our enemies are coming up with. The latest seems to be to introduce a motion of no confidence in the Prime Minister, which is likely to be successful given the makeup of the Commons. Try to force him to resign, thereby forcing through a so-called government of national unity, which will of course be nothing more than a coalition of Remainers intent on stopping Brexit. If that is countered in some way by a pro-Brexit interpretation of our dysfunctional, unwritten constitution, they'll just move on to something else. I was thinking a short while back that the wind was finally coming out of the sails of the Remainers, but it does seem that the closer we get to October the 31st, the more fanatical and harebrained their schemes become. The reason I think that direct action is required is because we can't rely on anything legal or political. My original idea, vague as it was to get enough people to blockade Parliament closer to the time in order to prevent a Remainer sit-in, which they might attempt in order to prevent Boris from proroguing Parliament. If the MPs can be prevented from actually entering Parliament, then they can't enact any legislation to stop what is still at present the default option. As it stands, and as I understand it, if no further legislation is passed, we will leave the EU on the 31st of October. Further legislation is what we have to counter, and that means stopping the MPs from going to work. Along with those aforementioned tossers who just want to ridicule me, there have been some suggestions about what else to do. Someone suggested turning up at MPs' houses and preventing them from leaving. The trouble with that is that we could get done for unlawful imprisonment or kidnap or some such thing. Personally, I'd rather not risk that. Preventing them from getting to work, I'd say, was a much better idea, but we'd have to contend with them getting to the chamber through some other means. I've never been to the cabinet war rooms, for instance, but are there secret wartime passages that they could use? If so, we'd need to block those. It's only like a picket line. And a picket line is a really good example, and this is an example I've used before. During the 1972 miners' strike, there was a coking plant that was a vital piece of the UK's energy infrastructure. It was picketed by 200 miners, and in response, 800 policemen were sent to confront them and prevent them from shutting the plant down. In the febrile atmosphere of the time, when the unions were heavily influenced by hardline communists, the call went out to other engineering unions in nearby Birmingham to support the pickets. The call was answered by 30,000, who marched over the hill, swamped the police and forced the closure of the plant. This could be said to have been the high point of the power of the trade unions in the UK, and led indirectly to the fall of the Tory government of Edward Heath 2 years later. It could also be said that within that victory lay the seeds of the emasculation of the trade unions by Margaret Thatcher after her victory against the miners in 1984. But that's not what's important here. What's important with regard to Brexit is that people power, when applied, is overwhelming. In 1972, outnumbered miners called out for support to their comrades, and their call was answered, big time. The tables were turned. They were turned very quickly, and they were turned very, very easily. All that was required was numbers. And numbers is all that is required now to defend the democratic mandate of the referendum. No heroism is required, no sacrifice other than the gumption to get off your arse and get down to Parliament. That is all that is required to ensure Brexit and to save democracy in the United Kingdom. Surely that's not too much to ask, is it?